What's up, guys? I'm Chris Spags here, back with another Four Corners video breaking down today's 6-game NBA slate, courtesy of Osmo.com. Yesterday, we had a tough slate with a lot of landmines, but the power of positivity can continue to carry us to success, so like this video right now. Leave a comment down below telling me which guy you like the most on today's slate. It all helps us out a lot, all the interaction, all the likes, so please do that right now. Like the video right now, leave a comment, and I'll jump in with you guys a little later today. The first corner I wanted to hit on is a game with the Warriors visiting the Rockets. This one is a 230.5 point total. It represents a slate high, and it's a 3.8 point boost for Houston and a 4.5 point drop for Golden State. Chris Paul's 28% expected ownership by us at Osmo.com right now would make him the highest owned on the slate. He put up 59.75 fantasy points the last time he played Golden State. That was a game without James Harden, though, and we did see a lot of great games last playoff from Chris Paul against the Warriors as well. Chris Paul's certainly a little bit bitter about missing that playoff series after going out with a hamstring issue. That you're going to see him continue to push his effort in this game, so don't mind matching the field with where his ownership is. James Harden had 44 points, 10 rebounds, and 15 assists the last time that he played Golden State, but that one was without Chris Paul. So we're going to have both these guys in the lineup today. It's going to cut into their upside a little bit, but I actually don't hate playing both together because I think both these guys are highly motivated against Golden State for, again, that playoff disappointment and sending a message heading into the playoffs this year. I think are both things that the Rockets are going to want to do. Clint Capella has been up and down versus Golden State in his career, but I think he's an okay play today. Not a guy I'm trying to get to, but with where the field is, I think around 20% expected ownership, that seems about fine to me for where Clint Capella should be. PJ Tucker had 46 fantasy points the last time he played Golden State, but that was the game without James Harden, so you're probably not going to see that much of an upside again here. He's a fine value guy, but he's going to be a little bit higher owned than he probably should be given the fact that he's not going to have that high of a usage. He'll still get some open looks from the corner because that's just what the Warriors are always willing to give him, but I don't think he's a fantastic play and not a guy you're going to want to load up on a really high amount. We have no Kevin Durant today who's resting for the Warriors. So that is a good opportunity for all these guys, especially Klay Thompson. Goes from a 1.03 fantasy point per minute player to a 1.241 in minutes without Kevin Durant on the court. Klay Thompson looks like a strong play. He's been priced up a little bit for this opportunity, but I think he's still in a good spot here, and I like him quite a bit. Steph Curry goes from 1.36 fantasy points per minute to 1.44 fantasy points per minute in court time without Kevin Durant. Not as big of a boost as Klay Thompson gets on paper, but it's still a very nice spot for Steph Curry. The defense is going to come after him, but I think he's still a perfectly good situation for him. But I still like him quite a bit. I think it's a really good spot for him to get going without Durant, so I'm very comfortable having a good amount of Steph Curry tonight. Draymond Green is one of the Warriors who actually gets worse with Kevin Durant off the floor. Goes from 1 fantasy point per minute to 0.9 fantasy points per minute. I'm still okay with him. He's at a pretty reasonable price. He should have some playmaking upside here versus a Rockets team who's going to close out on shooters pretty well, so I don't mind Draymond today, but I'm not necessarily trying to get him into lineups at a hardcore level. And DeMarcus Cousins had 46.5 fantasy points last time that he played Houston, a little bit over 2 weeks ago. It's a nice spot again. He only shot 4 for 12 in that game, so he's going to have some more upside, some more usage with Kevin Durant off the floor. So this all looks good for DeMarcus Cousins, and I like him quite a bit with his price being down a little on DraftKings. The next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Nets visiting the Thunder. This one also has a slate high 230.5 point combined total, which represents a 3.6 point boost for the Thunder, while the Nets are flat with their season average. Russell Westbrook had 71.75 fantasy points in a game versus Brooklyn earlier this year. Obviously, you can't project him to have that same output again, but I think it does bode well for him having a nice matchup today. He's expected to have 21% ownership right now. I think that seems fair, maybe a little bit low overall. I like Russell Westbrook today, and I'll probably go a little bit over the field on where you were projecting him right now. Paul George had 77.25 fantasy points in that same game versus Brooklyn. I think his shoulder's a bit of a risk, though. He did shoot 2 for 8 versus Utah, and the Nets limit threes pretty well, even though Paul George did shoot 6 for 13 in that first matchup. Paul George's shoulder really is the concern for me here. I think Utah limits his usage pretty well in general, so maybe it was an aberration, but I think there's some reason to have concern for Paul George. I would just match the field's ownership on him right now. We have him at about 17%. That seems fair given the risk involved with Paul George and his shoulder issues. Dennis Schroeder put up 18 shots last game while Paul George receded into the background. I think that makes Dennis Schroeder an interesting play if you're not playing Paul George in a lineup. Not a guy I'm trying to go to a lot. His price is still up a little bit for when Paul George was out, but Dennis Schroeder, an interesting contrarian play if you are going to leave Paul George out of your lineups. Steven Adams and Jeremy Grant grade out pretty similarly to me. I think I would prefer Adams slightly. He's going to be at about half the ownership of Jeremy Grant, so that would give me a little more favoritism towards Adams, but both these guys look okay. Really don't have an issue with either. D'Angelo Russell's price is coming down, but his minutes still feel a bit risky with Spencer Dinwiddie back in the lineup. He's projected for a 16% ownership right now. That seems fair to me for D'Angelo Russell. Not a guy I'm trying to go crazy over the field on because he has shown some pretty big downside and not a lot of upside recently. But if he is going to show upside, this is the spot to go to him and to hope that he could have that. Spencer Dinwiddie's been over 44 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games. The last game versus Detroit ended up being a blowout, so Dinwiddie didn't see his full run. But he's in a good spot again here. I think he's a little safer than Russ given his price being cheaper. You know he's going to get about high 20s, low 30s minutes. I think that all bodes well for Spencer Dinwiddie. Not a guy who I'm trying to force into a ton of lineups, but I think a guy who you want to have some exposure to because he does have pretty high ceiling in this matchup. Jarrett Allen's projected for the most ownership in the game at 22%. His minutes have been up recently, and Steven Adams has not been as imposing to opposing centers as he has been in recent months. So I think it's a nice spot to go to Allen. I don't mind him here. I think the ownership seems a little high, but his price is so cheap on DraftKings at $4,700. I really don't mind Jarrett Allen at all. And Caris LeVert and Joe Harris should see some more secure minutes now that Damari Carroll's been ruled out with a knee injury. I don't mind either of the guys. I think LeVert has probably got a little more upside, but Harris is going to get a little more of a secure role, a little more court time as well. So I think that Joe Harris interests me. Caris LeVert, an interesting tournament guy. You could have that upside to win you one. Our next corner is the game I'm most iffy on, but I wanted to include it because I think it does have some upside and not a ton of ownership on it. It's a game with the Jazz visiting the Suns, and it has a 221.5 point combined total, which represents a 4.3 point boost for Utah and a 0.3 boost for Phoenix. DeAndre Ayton's projected to be the highest owned guy in this game at 25% ownership. I think he looks like a good play. His price is a little bit cheaper for the matchup with Rudy Gobert, even though, as we talked about, the center matchup versus Utah isn't as bad as it has seemed on paper in previous years. So I don't mind Ayton here. Josh Jackson is projected for comparable ownership to Ayton, and I would much rather pay up for Ayton than take the value play of Josh Jackson, even though he does look okay as a value guy. Devin Booker's had 59.75 and 67.5 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games. He's also gotten 23 shots in those games, which I think is interesting here. It's a contrarian play who's going to be owned in the single digits. I think he's an interesting guy to have today. The Suns have won 4 out of the last 5, including wins over Golden State and Milwaukee, 2 teams who are really just better than the Suns are. So the Jazz, I think, would also fit that criteria. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Suns keep this close, and if they do, it's probably going to come at the hands of Devin Booker. Kelly Oubre hasn't shown much upside recently, but he's a very steady play, and he does have that 50-plus fantasy point ceiling, so I have no problem with Kelly Oubre. Certainly would prefer Booker more, but Oubre very much in the mix for me if I am going to stack up this game. Tyler Johnson as well. It seems like a value play who could have some upside. I really would only play him in a game stack, though, because I don't think he would be the one guy to have an outlier performance out of everybody here, but if the Suns keep it close, I think he could have a day, so I don't mind Tyler Johnson, but only in a game stack. On the Jazz side, Rudy Gobert is in a good spot versus a poor Suns interior who allows a lot of shots at the rim, a lot of rebounds as well. Really have no issue at all with playing Rudy Gobert, even though he's going to take a little bit of a downtick with Ricky Rubio back in the lineup. And Ricky Rubio is expected back, and a fun fact about him, he's only been under 32.25 fantasy points once since the 2016-2017 season versus Phoenix. It's a nice spot for Rubio. I think it's a good situation for him to return to. I think the minutes are a bit of a risk given the fact that he just keeps going in and out of the lineup, but overall, I don't mind Ricky Rubio, and I think he's in a pretty good spot and a good price. Donovan Mitchell has some less upside now that Ricky Rubio's back, and have a little bit less time as a playmaker, a little bit less time with the ball in his hands, but he's still going to shoot a lot. He's probably going to shoot over 20 times this game. That offers a ton of upside versus this Phoenix team who's allowing a very high field goal percentage from the floor. So I have no problem with Donovan Mitchell today. And I think if anything, he may be a forgotten man with Rubio back in the lineup. Jay Crowder and Joe Ingles still look pretty fine to me. I'd prefer Crowder with the discount now that we have Rubio back in the lineup, but really either guy looks okay. They're both serviceable wings, and that's really enough to get them into your player pool for today's slate. Derek Favors' price is up, even though his minutes have been down to the low 20s recently, but he could be very productive per minute for the same reasons Rudy Gobert should be productive. So I don't mind Derek Favors, but he's certainly not a priority with his price all the way up to $5,700 on DraftKings. The last corner I want to hit on, and as I mentioned, this was a tough choice with these last 2, so make sure to check the columns Switch and Hedge in the description right now. I do have details on all the games, including the Orlando-Washington game, which was a very tough cut, but I think it's interesting to talk about. My last corner is a game with the Grizzlies visiting the Hawks. This one is a 222.5 point combined total, which represents a 10.2 point boost for Memphis, which is a slate high, as well as a 1.7 point decrease for Atlanta. Mike Conley's been over 46.75 fantasy points in his last 3 games. It's a pace-up spot. He's looking good. He's projected for 19% ownership right now, and I think I'd go above that for Mike Conley based on what we're seeing recently and this really, really great matchup versus Atlanta. Avery Bradley is actually going to be a little bit higher owned than Mike Conley according to our ownership projections at Osmo.com right now. He does project a lot better if you just use the Memphis stats instead of his Clippers stats, which were much less impressive. So Avery Bradley is a guy who I have no problem matching the field on if he's going to be at about 20% owned. He also has some upside. So Avery Bradley has been shooting 17, 18 times in some games. I like him quite a bit. Jonas Valanciunas and Joakim Noah have both been seeing decreased minutes recently, but the center spot versus the Hawks is the one where you can really pile up stats. So both these guys are in play for me. I think the minutes is a little bit of a concern, but you could see a monster day out of either of these guys. I think I prefer Jonas by a pretty decent margin, but either guy is okay by me. Delon Wright's minutes have been there in a pace-up spot with some turnovers that are going to happen on Atlanta's side. He's in a good situation again. Delon Wright has shown 37 fantasy point upside off the bench recently. His minutes are in the high 20s. I think he's in a good spot again, and I really don't mind putting him in there, even though his price is a little bit high for where you'd want him to be. Trae Young is expected to have 20% ownership on him, and that does seem a little bit high to me, especially given the fact that he's come back down to earth recently. But he did put up 40.5 fantasy points versus Memphis earlier this year, and the usage should still be there for him, so I don't mind Trae Young, even though that ownership number really does seem a bit high given the Memphis matchup. I'd prefer to go to John Collins over Trae Young. He's at 64 fantasy points and 45.5 fantasy points in his last 2 games. Dwayne Dedmon being back to the rotation last game, I think, hurt him a little bit, but their minutes are staggered, and Dwayne Dedmon's on a minutes restriction right now, so I think that should help Collins out. If we did see Dedmon get a start, I think I'd bump Collins down and probably would prefer Trae Young a little bit more. But I think this upside with Collins coming when Dwayne Dedmon has been sidelined is not a surprise. I think that it's a good spot for Collins, but it's a better spot if he's staying away from Dwayne Dedmon on the court. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on today's NBA slate. And of course, make sure to like the video right now. Leave a comment down below. Tell me which player is your favorite on the slate. The likes help us out a lot. The comments are a lot of fun. We get to engage. We're building a little community here. So please like the video right now and leave a comment down below. And use the promo code SWITCHINGHEDGE on Osmo.com. Get half off your first month. Get all the ownership projections, which I reference in here. Rankings from Osmo, who's a top player in the world. Projections from Josh Engelman. You can plug in a Fantasy Cruncher. All the stuff that you want there to help you make a better DFS player out of yourself or at your fingertips. So use the promo code SWITCHINGHEDGE to get half off your first month. I'll be back again tomorrow with another Four Corners video, so good luck.